And then I'm going to let everyone in. Is that okay? Great. Hi, welcome everyone. If you could please mute yourselves while entering, that'd be fantastic. And we'll get started in just a few minutes. If everyone can mute themselves, that'd be greatly appreciated, and we'll get started in about a minute. Alrighty, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jillian Ertel. I'm Senior Program Officer for North America Under2 Coalition at Climate Group. And today we are wrapping up our phase 1 of our Green Recovery Alliance, and we wanted to pass on some information regarding accessing federal funds for U.S. subnational governments. And this specific topic is on climate mitigation plan development and EPA climate pollution reduction grants. Tom, if you could go ahead and move forward. So yeah, this is just a bit of an introduction and agenda. So first we'll be doing welcome remarks from both myself and our partners at Center for Climate Strategies. We'll go a bit into the project overview and then more into the technical stuff regarding the EPA climate pollution reduction grants. So any questions you would like to ask us, we're more than happy to answer, and then we'll go into next steps and closing remarks. Yeah, just before we move on, if you want to put your name in the chat, there's a lot of us today, so it might be a bit overwhelming, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're coming from today. So yeah, this is for the Green Recovery Alliance, the intent of this webinar, and this is a partnership between Center for Climate Strategies, which we refer to as CCS, and Climate Group. And Climate Group is the Secretariat for the Under2 Coalition. And the intent of this project was to provide this tailored support to the U.S. subnational governments to plan the acquisition and targeted use of federal funds. And so this was for the IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act, along with other economic recovery funds. So about Climate Group, in case you're unfamiliar with Climate Group, we are the host of Climate Week New York City, and we're also the Secretariat of the Under2 Coalition, which is actually the largest global network of states, regions, provinces, and other subnational governments. And the goal is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So right now it has 167 individual states and regions, along with several other national and subnational governments. And so there's a total of about 270 actors, and this represents more than 50% of the global GDP. So the intent is to accelerate climate action, and we have these 4 work streams, which is pathways, policy action, transparency, and diplomacy. And the intent is to do this through state and regional governments, because we believe that these subnational governments are uniquely placed to develop and implement these policies that can create net zero impact. So that is a bit about Climate Group, and I'll pass it over to our partners at Center for Climate Strategies.
Ariana, I'm going to let you do the favors here on CCS.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Arianna Ogliano. I'm Senior Project Manager, Policy Analyst with the Center for Climate Strategies. So CCS was founded in 2004. Tom is our founder, current president and CEO. We are a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and we work on in US, but also globally in many regions of the world. We are a leading catalyst for climate solution. We work both with private and public sectors. So we work with governmental agencies at national and state and local levels, as I said, in US and across the globe. I would say we have 3 core areas of expertise that goes from stakeholder engagement, policy planning and analysis, and capacity building. So all our projects try to cover the 3 areas. We really believe that we want to empower the people we work with. So that's why we always work along with capacity building programs to make sure that our expertise gets transferred and we build self-determination in the different jurisdictions. Tom, you want to go ahead? Next one. So in terms of scope of the project, I don't think we need to say much here. Gillian very much already covered everything, but the Green Recovery Alliance was funded over a year ago. We are working under funding support from the New York Community Trust, and the project is basically coming to an end, at least for the phase 1. So we have worked during the past year with many jurisdictions, many of you that are here with us today, in understanding how the federal funding programs work, where are opportunities to access these fundings, which can be some of the strategies to access this funding. And we have been working with states, but also with localities, and sometimes many of them at the same time to look at multi-jurisdictional applications. Next one. Okay, Tom, you want to get started from here?
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. We have a lot of great participants on the call right now, and I do want to acknowledge right now that we have a number of people who are from jurisdictions, as well as those who are involved in partnerships with them and other related activities. And we do want to try to make sure we have some time for peer exchange and discussion and Q&A at the end. I'm just going to review a couple of the key aspects of the pollution reduction grant. It's within the Inflation Reduction Act. It is administered by EPA. And this is, as I think all of you know, this is really a combination of formula-based and competitive grants for planning and assessment, but the follow-on grants that are competitive or for implementation, which is very critical. So the first piece of this is creating a set of formula-based grants for states, tribes, and territories, and the large metro areas in the country, 67 SMSAs. And as I think all of you know, the deadline for an expression of interest has already passed, and we're now looking at 2 pretty quick deadlines here. The first being the end of April for states, and the second being the end of May for the SMSAs, and looking at a completion date for work that is conducted by about this time next year. The awards are expected later this year, in the summer or so. So what it functionally means is that there will be a compressed time period for the implementation of the grants, and we want to talk a little bit about how to handle that compression in time. But it also means that there's a compressed time period for the application process, particularly for states. We're really sensitive to that. What we want to try to do today is share resources with you and share connections to help you accelerate your response to the grant. And folks, just do put yourselves on mute in case you're not and there's any background noise. Just to also note that this is broken into early stage and later stage action plans. We'll say more about that in a minute. But they transition into eligibility to apply for competitive grants for implementation out of a $4.6 billion pool. Note we'll come back to later is it's recommended that this be coordinated with other federal funding opportunities, particularly the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We would expect in a year that based on the results of the initial planning, that the applicants and awardees for these planning and assessment grants then would be in a position to apply for the implementation funding to follow. We know that will start next year. We're not sure when it ends. So the application process has a number of requirements. We're going to step through these and some resources that we hope will be helpful here, and certainly want you all to share questions and share thoughts as we go through this. Again, we know this is a peer network with a lot of people who are actively involved in this application right now and who can help applicants with it. So we really want to open the floor here for that kind of exchange. Please drop things in the chat or otherwise if you'd like. And if you would like to comment later, we'll certainly have opportunities for that. But a couple of key things in terms of the deliverables. There needs to be an approach, a work plan, which is really an anchor point here with an approach for the development of the priority climate action plan and a comprehensive climate action plan, and a status report will ultimately be required. We'll go through the general approach and what will be involved in that, and where you possibly can get some help on some existing templates and cases. It will include a budget. We'll go to this in a minute as well, because there is a pretty solid budget template that EPA has provided. And then the responsible entities have to complete all of this, and they have to meet a set of milestones. And we'll walk through a little bit about what those milestones might look like. Most states have, and for that matter, localities and metropolitan areas, a great many, and in the case of states, I think most have done some level of climate action planning already. So the application process and the implementation of the awards specifically recognize that and give you an opportunity to build upon past efforts. And when you take a step back and look at this from a global basis, this is very much in parallel with the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions by individual countries. And the watchwords there are further develop and implement. It's recognized that everybody is at some point in the planning process, but there's still more to do. So EPA is going to be asking you to clarify how you will further develop and implement plans that may already be in place. If you don't have any existing plans in place or in progress, it's okay, because this is also specifically designed to get those moving on an accelerated basis. We'll talk about some of these individual components and some key issues here in just a bit. Couple things to note. Stakeholder engagement is important and will need to be spelled out. We'll cover some of the approaches and templates for that in a minute. But also the plans themselves will have multiple components, and they are going to require some significant technical effort to complete. And a lot of this involves the specification of policy actions and their impacts, but this will walk through the architecture for this, but this isn't going to involve the establishment or the identification of emissions reduction targets and other associated targets. It will include greenhouse gas inventory and projections. We will refer to that as baselines or reference case occasionally here on an interchangeable basis. It also will include the identification of quantifiable measures for emissions reductions. We'll walk through that momentarily also, but I think the important thing to call out here is that a line-by-line identification and assessment of these policy measures will be required and will need to be supported by line item granular impact analysis. And we'll show some of the tools by which that can be done in a little bit. And this will involve both near-term and longer-term actions and a number of metrics, which include greenhouse gas reductions, but also impacts on different socioeconomic categories, including low income. There doubtless will be other important metrics to jurisdictions as they go through this that can be included. Also workforce analysis. And then for the measures that are identified and quantified, there needs to be an identification of the authority to implement. We'll talk about this in a little bit as well, because that authority can come at different levels of government. And then how federal funds will be leveraged. Again, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will be one of the principal opportunities for that, but there are many others. Just to cap, for those of you who don't know, the Inflation Reduction Act has, about $370 billion of incentives and other opportunities to support climate change mitigation. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is much larger and has something like 370 different programs in it that are potentially available. So there is a really huge universe of potential federal funding sources here. And this is a golden opportunity to use planning as a way to identify how to match the uses of these funds through policy actions with the sources of these funds, including federal sources. EPA has put together a number of very significant resources to support this application process. And my personal comment here would just be to express an enormous amount of appreciation for how much EPA has done. Obviously, they have been working very, very hard at putting a number of guidance documents and tools together here. We won't go through all these, but if you haven't been to the EPA site, you really should do that, and be sure you download the specific templates they have for things like budgets, inventories, projections, et cetera. They have really tried to make this as clear and straightforward as possible. And as I mentioned, the guidance includes tools as well: emissions reductions, emissions inventory projections, emissions reductions measures, analysis of benefits, and we'll comment on some of those tools and some of the ways to approach them here in a minute. But the EPA has put together a great resource. We wanted to give a bit of an overview of climate change mitigation, because this really feeds into the question mark of how you develop the approach for the applications. Again, clock is ticking. They're due in a couple of weeks here, and we know everybody's under the gun to make this happen. So we wanted to offer resources and some thoughts and possibly some tips here that would be helpful. First, just a momentary note on history. We've been doing this for a while. CCS was started all the way back in 2004. And I was working on the climate change issue prior to that time. I started all the way back in 1995 when I was in the US Senate, and that was when we were deliberating over the Kyoto Protocol. An awful lot has happened since then, but the concept and practice of comprehensive climate action planning has really evolved over time. It's been driven by need, not just emissions reductions, but the need to accomplish other important things at the same time. And economic recovery has really stood out from day one and continues to be a very important part of that. And that's been a driving part of the formation of this Green Recovery Alliance project that we are doing. Before 2000, understandably, the plans were a little bit more in the startup mode and focused on scoping and structuring and measurement, but they really did start to focus on subnational government. And the concept in the United States, which is actually true worldwide, that is that the bottom-up process of developing policy is really critical to enabling countries to meet their commitments. From 2000 forward, the gears started to shift towards more intensive comprehensive planning. This became more mainstreamed at the subnational level, and a lot of the economic issues were being more heavily integrated. And then approaching 2020, the focus on implementation really deepened and sharpened. We did see the Paris Agreement come about, which was in part driven by the templates and mainstreaming of comprehensive climate action in the United States and other countries as a format for countries worldwide to use. As Ariana mentioned, through our work, the focus on capacity building and self-determination has really taken front center stage along with equitable transition. And as we look forward, what we're seeing now is a focus on the conversion of policy development to financing and investment so that functionally climate action plans become financing plans. We'll talk about how you can get that ball rolling, but that's clearly something that is going to be expected as a part of this. We also see just tremendous changes in technology opportunities from in comparison to the past. So there's a very high level of focus on the updating of technology assessments. The cost structure for renewable energy today is absolutely incomparable to what it was even a decade ago. We also see now a lot more intensive targeting and tracking of social equity metrics and the blending of climate change mitigation and adaptation. These are two separate things that can be linked and are of parallel importance going forward. Some of the key parameters for these climate action planning approaches are that they're multi-objective, they're sequential, implementation-driven, stakeholder-based, they're collaborative, they include all levels of government, all time periods, a full suite of implementation actions, and that they're fact-based and empirical. And we translate these into a work plan, into a process, into a set of tools and templates, into timelines, into participation, into everything that it takes to achieve an end result here. And our icon for this is the alligator, and I know I'm going to get it from a couple biologists in the crowd. This is actually a crocodile. So pardon me, but we use this when we're doing work in other countries, and there are more crocodiles in other countries than there are alligators. But the notion is that we've got an uphill climb in greenhouse gas emissions, and it needs to go down to meet targets. And that alligator or crocodile needs to close its jaws by taking bites out of the emissions curve. And it does that by taking bites out one policy measure at a time. But it's got to do something else that's really important at the same time. Not only does it have to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions, it has to reduce poverty levels, and it has to close other really important gaps. So really the best practice here and the opportunity that has been proven over time is the ability to identify and design and implement actions that do all of these things at the same time. And this is the open door that the EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant provides. And there are procedures for this and a tremendous amount of evidence now that it can be done. It will require coverage of all economic sectors. This is both energy and resource sectors, so it needs to be comprehensive. The reality is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to meet net zero greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals without a multi-sector effort. It needs to include all levels of government. And even within any given level of government, it needs to include horizontally all corners of government. It needs to include agriculture, transportation, energy, et cetera, in addition to including local, state, federal, tribal, territorial governments, regional governments. So really, we have to have all different levels and dimensions of government involved. All of them bring unique authorities and capabilities for implementation. It's really critical that these be collaborative and they result in the development of a consensus around action. Policy actions don't implement well without a broad base of agreement and support. And there is a procedure for going through that process to bring people together to participate, to be included in the actual development and implementation of policy. And all evidence is that policies that are produced through that process have a much higher rate of implementation and adoption than those who don't. So it's really quite critical. And of course, we know that two heads are better than one. So this is an opportunity and a need. We also know that the inclusion of fairness, equity, and a whole range of targeting and tracking metrics and methods are required to be able to foster this transition to these very significant new goals. And we'll comment a little bit more on that in a bit. I think the takeaway comment here is this simply cannot be an afterthought for planning anymore. And I think EPA is pretty clear about the fact that this needs to be a front center objective in the development of these climate action plans. And finally, they do need to set the stage for a transition to funding. We won't see implementation without money being behind these actions. Now, it'll take more than that. It'll take governance actions and mechanisms, and it'll take measurement systems and capacities. But without money, this is just not going to happen. So we want to be sure that this process is conducted in a way that sets up the transition to investment. And we pulled these things together just to try to be helpful a little bit more than a year ago at the invitation of the ABLE Foundation in Baltimore to put a paper together that would really stake out the territory in terms of defining what leadership actions are on climate change. And one of the principal audiences here were people at the local and state level who in leadership positions ask a basic question, and that is, what is the definition of being a leader on this issue? And it really captures much of what we just reviewed here. It's putting in place targets that are measurable, putting justice and equity up front, covering the whole of government, being really specific about policy measures and mechanisms, including funding, and then making sure you've got your measurement systems in place behind them. But this is, I think, offered as a tool to use not just for your own sake, but in working with other members of the leadership community who are interested in or really need to advance a little further down the leadership learning curve here. Okay, so we'd like to talk a little bit specifically now about some process issues and templates that hopefully will be helpful to you. The first is we're going to introduce the basic concept of working backwards from end product. And the end product of these is some kind of a final report. I put some snapshots up here for a climate action plan we did for the state of Kentucky, but really that report will define a series of actions that have been agreed upon and specified and will be then transmitted by a convening authority to implementing authorities. So it's really the definition of what will happen as a consequence of these planning efforts. In a minute, I'll show you some links to our website at the Center for Climate Strategies. We have a lot of these that you can look at, and you can see the case examples of how this is done. But when you work your way backwards from this, there's a lot to do. Here's the listing from our website of climate action plans that we have developed in cooperation with states and localities and their stakeholders, and a little snapshot of some of the line item results, the end results that come out of this. I'll be referring to some of these as we go through, but we've got a pretty big listing of these action planning process reports that are all open, all public. You should feel free to access these and use information out of them. I'm going to be walking through some of the contents of these that are available to you to try to help you in your work this next couple of weeks. When you work your way to the end, backwards from the end product here, what you pretty quickly realize is that you need to do something in a stepwise fashion. And climate action planning is a complex sequential process. And so we've listed here the series of steps typically that are involved. We like to call this the 10-step process. And this has been very, very effective. It's been very, very widely applied, not just in the United States, but in other countries. There are certainly some variations on this, but you can look into the climate action plan reports that we have, and there are other reports out there that do the same thing, that will identify these steps and then spell out exactly how they get implemented. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a minute. That process requires a lot of tools and templates. So I've broken out a few categories here, and a few of the, or several of the tools and templates that are typically needed and are available. So the good news is that you can get your hands on good templates. We have, I think, virtually all of these, and they're publicly available for the most part, that you can use either putting your applications together or implementing the awards. And where there are gaps, there are certainly ways to fill them. The bad news is there are a lot of tools, and they have to be intelligently matched to the tasks and the timelines and the deliverables and the capacities that are available. And so that is a significant task for the design and management of these projects. And I'll comment on some of the more specific tools and templates in each of these areas. They are embedded in these climate action plans that are on the website. You'll see them throughout. Some of them are called out specifically. We also have, with each of the climate action plan reports, a set of technical appendices that really get into the weeds and use a lot of these templates. And so there's a bit of a treasure chest there that you can draw upon. One of the big things that you have to do is put together the approach or the work plan. And when you go into the climate action plans that we've posted, we tried I think as often as we possibly could to be fully transparent and include really most of the work plans and approaches and all of their components in every one of them. And they will include tasks, timelines, deliverables, budgets. We actually have budgets posted in these that you can look at, the designation of technical and facilitative team members, the roles and responsibilities of participants, et cetera, et cetera. So these are typically very detailed memos or recommendations on how to approach a process that have been used to seek and obtain high-level governmental approval to launch these processes. And so again, we have a great many examples of these and plenty of content there that, again, it's open, it's public, it's there for your use. This will include things like how to get organized. This is one of the most critical early stage steps, and that is the organization of the planning and assessment process. And so at the top, we see a convening authority, and then it flows down to the participation by stakeholders and agencies in the actual decision-making process through technical work groups broken out by sectors. That's a fairly typical process. And it has a support structure in terms of project management and direction and facilitation. But these are designed so that they're comprehensive and highly participatory and directly involve stakeholders, diverse stakeholders across all these sectors in the stepwise decision-making process. You can see many, many examples of these in the reports. You can also see many examples of the scheduling of milestones of the planning processes. EPA is calling for two processes, a priority climate action plan and a comprehensive climate action plan. And we'll talk a little bit about how those get maybe overlapped and stitched together. What I am showing you here is more typical of the way this has been done, which has been an all-in inclusive process that ends up being comprehensive, but it has early and later stages. But you can see plenty of examples of this in the reports as well. Okay, so having a fact-based process means doing some level of design and quantification. This starts with the emissions inventory and forecast, which I'm sure everybody is really well familiar with. Typically, you have a good starting place on this at the state level, not necessarily at the local government level. So just a couple call outs here. This is super critical work. This needs to be done well. You could expect a new report to take a couple of months by a pretty top-notch team and be very in-depth and be 100+ page report plus appendices, et cetera. So these are significant undertakings, but they are foundational to the impact analysis that follows, because the policy impacts are all calculated above and beyond business as usual, which is what's really being documented here with the inventory and forecast. EPA has really great postings of spreadsheet tools for this, both inventory and projections. And I want to underscore that EPA has provided spreadsheet tools for projections, so that you can run these numbers out and their trajectories into the out years, which is essential to have a baseline and not just a base year for planning. So they have really, provided a great starting place, and there's plenty more that can be done, and typically is necessary to augment these as minimum standards to customize them to your own jurisdictional needs. They need to be designed to meet policy needs. So typically the framing of these in the process of identifying sources of emissions is also set up to support response actions that will reduce emissions from those sources. I think this is such a critical task that it's important not to underestimate the time and effort to have it done correctly if it has not been done already. And for local governments, I would just say, please be cautious if you are being offered free work that is going to be done as a part of a class project in a university or something. Well, that's, a good thing to do. And I teach, so I appreciate it. It may not be at a level that meets the standards that are required for policy development and planning. And you really do need to use an approach that meets those standards. And there are plenty of opportunities to do that. If you do want to work with an educational institution, one of the things to consider is bring them into a learning by doing process that's actually applying these full standards rather than shortcutting them. Then a next really important step in the process is identifying the actions that can potentially reduce emissions. So when I started, we didn't really know what was out there. And so there was a lot of guesswork. And today, if you fast forward, we have this enormous proliferation of policies and measures broken down by sectors and databases on top of databases that give you listings of things that potentially could work in your jurisdiction. So we actually have a databases at CCS that's available for your use there. In most cases, you're building upon a planning process that has already identified a series of things, and you're really looking at expansionary actions beyond that. But if you need to start from scratch, as we did, going all the way back to 2003, you can do that too by accessing these databases of actions that are potentially applicable in your jurisdiction. Lots of them there. So don't be frightened if you think you need to identify actions that you don't have under your nose already. Once you do that, the good news is that there are many, many, many different options. These are technologies and practices in every sector that can potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet other goals. And that's the good news. The bad news is there are too many to be designed and evaluated and managed during a planning process. You have to shrink that down or narrow that list. And so we use multi-criteria screening as a process. This is a snapshot of a tool we have, which lines up a set of decision criteria for screening and selection across the columns and then down the rows, different technologies, and lets the participants of a group go through the process of identifying those things they think will work best. So this is one of the critical components of consensus building. It allows a participatory decision, which is facilitated and supported with technical assistance to let people make intelligent and well-informed choices that nonetheless involve a combination of judgment and individual value. So this is a format for this. This is a process that should yield 50 or so priority actions for further development and implementation of a process. If this is done well, the experience is those actions stick pretty well in terms of getting to the finish line. They take some iteration and some things have to be ironed out, but the hit rate for these after they've gone through this kind of a process that again is participatory, supported by technical and facilitative assistance, and otherwise intelligent is really quite high. Once any individual action then is identified, and we'll call this a policy action, a policy measure, a policy option, we need to bring some specificity and transparency to it. And we do that through something called a policy option document. You can see the components of it. These really spell out the what and the how and the who is associated with each and every one of these individual measures. And this will become the basis of then further action on the analysis of these actions. These are actually parameters that are required for analysis. When they're all completed, they'll go into a technical appendix. They'll be fully transparent. Anybody can pick it up and read it and see what's going on here. So it's not a mystery. And again, you go to our reports and you'll see a lot of these. We did one report and I think the 10 technical appendices were 800 pages. So we really poured it on in terms of spelling out the details behind each and every one of them. But there are templates there and there are examples of them that you can use for this purpose. And let me just call out the implementation mechanisms line here. That really has a template within a template because we have a menu that you can use for identifying potential implementation actions. So there are plenty other backroom tools and templates behind these. Then we get into the actual impact analysis itself. And so the call out here is EPA is looking for a level of analysis associated with the priority climate action plans, and then another level in the longer term with the comprehensive climate action plans. And I just put a snapshot down here of a marginal cost curve, actually again from Kentucky, that looks at cost effectiveness numbers against the total emissions reductions for actions. That's really a very common metric that comes out, but only one of several that come out. The key things that really stand out from this first stage of analysis that you would expect coming out of a priority climate action plan is you certainly on a line item granular basis as well as a cumulative basis want to understand the greenhouse gas emissions impacts associated with each of these measures. You want to understand also what effect they have on the energy or resource system and the economic systems involved in that for each of those measures. They're going to be pushing and shoving things around, and you want to look at the activities that are affected by the implementation of these measures as a part of your analysis of emissions reductions. And you'll want to calculate social cost savings. Now, I say social because one level of analysis is you're looking at the impacts from the perspective of government and society. The other is you're going to be looking at it from the perspective of business and finance. And so the first step is we want to do a broad level analysis that really looks at the costs or the savings of implementing an action. At that stage, what you really want to do is also identify a potential budget need associated with the implementation of each. We've got plenty of examples of that and then templates for it. But I think in terms of the timing of what EPA is asking for, if you're going to be in submitting an application in a year for the $4.6 billion pot, you are going to have some assessment of the request of funds that you will be using for each and every one of these actions. So you will need some budget level analysis for that. When you take the next step forward into the comprehensive climate action plan, you will want to become more detailed and do more drill down at a financial analysis level. You will also probably want to do more assessment around macroeconomic costs and benefits, as well as other key issues, whether these are health improvements or other things. As a part of both first and second stages, you will want to include social equity analysis as a part of this as well. And there are a number of metrics associated with that. But I want to raise this in particular because of the dilemma so many jurisdictions will be facing on how to move quickly to put this kind of analysis in place in this first phase. And you can use somewhat simplified tools of analysis for this purpose that would, for instance, identify benchmarks for emissions reductions and benchmarks for costs and savings for individual measures. And then you can scale those to the level of effort that meets your own jurisdiction's need. And you can calculate that based on the inventory and forecast you do. And with the benchmarking and scaling process, you can get pretty good figures here in terms of what you're looking at for these, each and every one of these actions in terms of the spending and savings needs and the emissions reductions needs that are required. Emissions reductions calculations will come out from a calculation you do against your baselines. But you can do that kind of shorter term analysis. And then when you get into the longer term, bring a higher level of system-based analysis forward that's more complex, but it takes more time and more resources to get moving. But we would really encourage you to be pragmatic about making this happen in this first phase and taking it a step at a time. And you can do this early stage analysis, and then it can transition over to the later stage and more complex analysis. What that all will do is tell you where you're headed in terms of reducing emissions for each and every one of these policies and their sectors from this baseline, how far this alligator is going to get in terms of closing its jaws. And you should have very clear evidence of that. And EPA will want to see that evidence when you go into the completion of this phase and the application for the implementation grants. We have a tool that Holly has done for us and put on YouTube that is the greenhouse gas strategy tool. It's one of a set of tools that are out there that address this first stage level of needs, where it's a spreadsheet system. It requires you to have in place your baselines as well as a delineation of your policy measures and strategies, but then it has a spreadsheet-based system in it that allows you to run calculations around these things that can be done more quickly than a more complex model, but at a level that's quite robust. It's also very transparent. And this is out of a class of tools that are spreadsheet-based that really could be used for this early stage of analysis. On macroeconomic analysis, this is also something that can happen at an early and later stage. And we've done both. So one of the dilemmas that jurisdictions everywhere inside and outside the United States have is putting in place the capacity and the necessary resources to do full-scale macroeconomic modeling. And sometimes you can't do it fast enough or at low enough cost to use it anytime soon. We created an indicator-based tool that lets you do structural analysis of actions to do early stage guidance that tells you based on their design how they're likely to perform. And this has been created out of a high level of analysis we did of the much more intensive macroeconomic studies. But this is available and it's something you can use for doing structural assessment and screening of actions to see how they potentially will affect important elements of macroeconomic impact. This next graph is something that came out of actually the REMI model, which has been very widely used, and many of you are aware of this, that will do the much more complex macroeconomic analysis. We've worked with REMI quite a bit. I'm happy to give them a shout out here. This is such a very helpful tool because it does both the granular line item analysis, but it does all the equilibrium dynamics. And this one shows the different contributions to jobs, income, and growth for each of the individual actions. This is a way drill down that takes REMI and then looks into an individual action, building codes, and does the deep dive on exactly what are the pluses and minuses on jobs and income that happen for different components of a building codes thing. So if you really need to go to that level of depth, it's out there. This is not a first stage thing, though. This takes getting to the second stage. I'm sure I missed some other important parts of the planning process, but I'm going to just focus now on a couple of key issues that have come out of our conversation with participants in the Green Recovery Alliance project, and then other conversations we've had regarding the EPA pollution reduction grant. The first is, where do local governments fit? And the short story is that local governments can be included by states as full participants in their climate action planning processes, and in the process of identifying actions that need to be undertaken, and then the levels of government that make sense, whether that's local, state, federal, regional. So they really can be brought right in. Localities also can be included in the metro level or SMSA level processes in just the same way. So on our website, we have a process memo we did for, it's right here in front of me, the Southern California Association of Governments. And this involved, 112 or 121, I forget which cities and counties in the Los Angeles region as a part of this collective effort. So this is an example of a metro level, MPO level enterprise, a planning process that involved local government at a very, very inclusive level. So that is another way that local governments can be involved here. We have an interesting issue because we have awards going to state government as well as going to SMSAs, metropolitan level scale government. And obviously in many states, half the population, sometimes even more, within state boundaries is sitting in a metropolitan area. That metropolitan area may straddle more than one state. That's very common. So what do you do with that in terms of a scope of planning and assessment? And I don't have all of the answers yet. I'm sure EPA is going to be providing more guidance on this, but at this stage, for the purpose of putting together your approach, one of the opportunities and one of the suggestions would be what I'm going to call dovetailing. And that is that states should invite and include metropolitan area representatives in their planning process so you can exchange information about the scope that each of those processes is considering. And at the state level or the metro level, and then at the state level, if the metros are contemplating a series of things, you can either decide to ignore or incorporate them depending on what fits at the state level and vice versa. The metropolitan processes should dovetail by including state representation as well as local representation so that we have eyes wide open and open exchange here, and then can do some intelligent job of mapping out areas where we have potential overlap. And that overlap could turn into cooperation. It doesn't necessarily need to be complete separation, or certainly doesn't need to be competition, but to enable cooperation, we think dovetailing is an advisable thing to do that you could use as a recommendation in your approach. Stakeholder inclusion, and we have stakeholder and community engagement. I put a design process, a piece of one from one of our states. This was actually Michigan, that will spell out the details of how to do this at a stakeholder level. This was an interesting one because it occurred during the Great Recession when Detroit was, with the rest of Michigan, going through unbelievably challenging times. And it was really the stakeholders that put their foot down, quite a diverse group, and said climate action planning is going to be an essential part of the future of the state's economy. So we need to make this happen. But we've got an interesting example of that, but a lot of detail around exactly how that was designed and conducted. Capacity is going to be important to that. We don't have level playing field by stakeholders. And so often what we've done as an organization is help the philanthropic community identify capacity support grants that non-governmental stakeholders need to be able to come to the table and be able to participate, in kind of full strength along with other stakeholders. The other important thing to recognize is learning curves. It takes a little while for everybody to kind of get the hang of it. This is going to be a challenge for the first priority climate action plan that's coming your way, but it gets easier after that. But you do need to have a stepwise process that gives people some time to absorb and act on information and not expect them to be able to come in and go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. At the community level, the stakeholder level, there are tremendous templates for this that you can tap into. What we've seen at the community engagement level has been that it really needs to augment what's going on with the core stakeholder process, but then it has to customize. And that involves a lot of potential local conditions that need to be adjusted to. It's also really important that that be supported with public information education and a lot of access to process. And then, of course, learning curves are important here also. Lots of great examples on this. Social equity. Again, this is a forefront issue, and it's going to involve the identification of relevant metrics, targeting methods, target populations, tracking methods. And then this also is going to require enabling environment actions in terms of capacity and access. This is an area where I'm guessing that peer exchange will be really, really helpful, because I know states and localities and metro areas are all going through this now to determine their best approach, and hoping and expecting that EPA will provide some, flexibility and accommodation for approaches that are put forward that are suited to local need. There's a lot of resource material and tools available for this, but our experience is that this is really requiring quite a bit of sort of custom level assessment to determine what's going to work best in any particular location. And finally, the money machine side of this. So the first planning grant, or the first priority climate action plan, needs you to get to the point where you can make submissions into the $4.6 billion fund. And you'll need to have budget level requests that have some specificity around each of the policy measures. And this is going to require some economic and even financial analysis at this first stage. But that is going to need to go into a much deeper dive later on to actually put in place the financial mechanisms and the partnerships and the leveraging activities that need to take place. And so this is a bridge that is being built to go from planning to investment that is going to require some core activities that need to get rolling and then be really expanded quite a bit. It will require economic and financial analysis up front. The trick is going to be also identifying the end uses of funds and the levels that are needed for these policy measures, and then underneath them, a breakout of those activities, the functional activities involved with implementation, then to identify potential sources of funds from the public and private sector, covering a whole range of potential sources, and being in a position at some point to calculate whether subsidy mechanisms are going to be needed, and if so, how much to make that all work, and then bringing sources and uses together into a system, a policy and finance mechanism that will raise and distribute funds. We need to capitalize each of these programs with upstream funds, and we need to deploy them with downstream mechanisms. And we need to create partnerships that are required between project partners and implementing partners, and then financial partners to make that happen. And you can imagine at the end of the day, you have climate action plan that also is an investment plan or an investment portfolio or even a prospectus that will say, for our 50 measures, here are the investment opportunities and needs for each of them spelled out in some real detail. And you would source those needs through federal funds and other sources. And there are enabling environment activities that are going to be really very important to that. The big punchline here is now would be the time, if you have not already, to be in dialogue with the organizations in your state or region that are potentially going to be applicants for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and state level green banks, or regional and even local green banks or other financial institutions, and to understand how they might be approaching that and where the planning process and their application process might come together. It also would be a good time to be talking with other members of the state and local community who are interested in pursuing federal awards, so that you can coordinate with them, and ideally they would be brought into your planning processes. But the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is really a big and critical one. And as I think you all know, its application process is expected to begin in the middle of June. So now would very much be the time to have that conversation. And it'll go into blended finance, which is going to be sourcing from all these different things. And that's really the long term for climate change investment. It's really leveraging the private sector in particular to a very high level. This is just a snapshot of, a financial analysis tool we have that gives you an idea of what happens at those later stages where you start actually calculating where you have subsidy gaps that need to be filled with concessional financing and all that. This is the world of bringing in blended finance to make sure we get enough money. This is what can be done once you put the basics in place. The final thing is just technical assistance. If you can't do all of the work by yourselves in-house and you need help, I guess our recommendation is don't wait for the award to identify that assistance because of the time lags associated with procurements or even arranging agreements around in-kind assistance. It should start now. It shouldn't wait. Otherwise, you're going to really miss the wave here in terms of getting the support you need for implementation. And that ought to go right up front into your work plan and be spelled out so that you can accelerate its deployment starting now. And I'm going to stop there. I'm sure there are many questions here, and really, Jillian, turn it back to you and to Ariana to help us walk through any questions or thoughts folks have.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I wanted to raise a question that Carrie Hearn, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, raised to me via chat. And she was curious, or they were curious about the intersection between the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund. And if we're taking into consideration what we know about the applications dates, and they were specifically curious about the $7 billion competitive grant segment of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for LMI solution storage and community solar. If you want to elaborate more on that, feel free to unmute yourself, but Tom, I'll
Well,
give an answer to that.
Carrie, I think you are in Virginia with DEQ, if I recall. And so in your case, you would want to be talking to your point of contact who is going to be managing the application for the statewide pool of funds, the state level entity pool of funds for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. And so it's a $26 billion pot that's split between $7 billion to state designated entities. And then there's an $8 and a $12 billion set of pots that accompany that are open. The $7 billion is really expected to be, EPA said is expecting 60 awards, and the math on that's pretty simple. It's expecting to make one per state. And so folks in Mines, Minerals, and Energy in Virginia, and then they may be on the horn right now, I don't see the participant list, have been working on that application. And I think in every state, this is the dynamic where you would want to identify, the applicant or the potential applicant for the $7 million piece of that funding that's going to a state designated entity and coordinating. On the 8 and 12, they're open, and the state entity can also be an applicant for those two pools of money. They're a little bit different in terms of some of the scope of them, but those are expected to result in a lower number of awards. So organizations are sort of joining forces in terms of putting together applications that involve more than one state or possibly other configurations. You would want to talk to your point of contact about, whether there are opportunities also to be accessing funds. I think the part of that that's most important from a scope standpoint is EPA has not issued the final guidance, but the priority for the $7 billion is residential rooftop solar, and then enabling things like storage and transmission. It does say that other zero emissions technologies are eligible, but we've gotten the message fairly clearly that residential rooftop community-based solar is the high priority. The other pots of funding don't have that prioritization in place. So there may be a broader bandwidth that can be worked with on those other pots.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, this is Carrie. I'm with the Virginia Department of Energy. And
Okay.
we are coordinating with the folks at DEQ. I know Angela Conroy's on the line today. And yeah, so I think my question is also about the early coordination with the development of the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund application and or planning there in terms of sort of assuming, making a bold assumption that that segment will potentially be covered through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $7 billion around residential solar and community solar, and therefore, not necessarily like what is that integration or dovetailing between those two applications, or do you just sort of assume that one is taken care of from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund side, and so it's not a necessary component to really detail in the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund?
And I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were with Energy, but all the better. So I think EPA has included a note in the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund guidelines that it would like to see an expression of approach on coordination with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and for that matter, other federal sources. In a perfect world, the timing for both of these would be just the same, so that you would go through a planning process that would lay out the listing of the policy measures that require investment in federal sources, and that would become the basis of the application to the $4.6 billion implementation fund next March, as well as applications for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. But unfortunately, those applications have to be in by October. So you probably are going to have to do a hurry up drill if you haven't already. And you can do that by working together with DEQ on this planning process to put in place a framework and as quickly as possible identify those specific policies and measures that you want to push forward for implementation investment. Try to get as much clarity on them as you can in terms of the level of funding that will be needed and the specific uses and then the mechanisms associated with it. But as it stands right now, it sounds like there's a little bit of a mismatch in timing, and you're going to have to do a little bit of advanced work on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Another question we have from Amber Greeny is, in smaller cities get trickle-down funding?
I might need more specifics on that.
Yeah, happy to provide. So I know that there's 4 states that did not apply for these CPRG funds. And in that case, it was my interpretation that that $12 million would be reallocated to smaller states that applied for CPRG funds that were not in the designated MSAs. Am I understanding that interpretation correctly?
I don't know, and that would be one for EPA to respond to. The
Okay.
hope would be that it gets reallocated and not lost, obviously.
Yeah, Tom, they're planning on redistributing funding that's not left or that's left over. So they have multiple scenarios when there's a denial of funds. They spelled out in one of their webinars pretty well.
And Nick, has
Thank you,
that
Nick.
changed the $3 million and $1 million figures then, so that applicants have a new number to work with?
Yeah, I believe they're going to divide it up, based on whoever did not submit a notice of intent.
Yeah.
They have a formula for it.
Great, thanks, Nick. I'm just going to move along in the chat for the questions. So Glade Sowers, I believe from Utah, said the CPRG Plan and Grant Program requires state to develop PCAPs to identify GHG reduction strategies that are ready for CPRG implementation grant funding in Q1 of next year. However, a lot of the GHG policies are not necessarily oriented around grant supports, and many don't result in direct GHG emission reductions. Can you help us get a handle on the appropriate scope and scale of GHG reduction strategies to be included in the PCAP, even the CCAP?
And if anybody has a better reading of this, I'd invite them to join in here. But my reading of EPA's applications guidelines is that it would like to see an identification of specific policy measures in each of the sectors that have a demonstrable potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions against at least a statewide baseline. And that those will be backed with some level of quantification so that they will have direct emissions reductions benefits. I am thinking out loud whether there are actions that would have indirect greenhouse gas reduction benefits, but not direct. And the only thing I could think about would be some enabling actions. If, for instance, you would consider energy storage to be something that doesn't have a direct emissions reduction benefit, but enables renewable energy deployment so that it would contribute to that. That would be a scenario possibly where an indirect contribution would be included. And of course, that is an absolutely critical component of renewable energy deployment. But I think what the expectation is that this will be all spelled out, as pretty much as specifically as possible as a part of the submission process.
And if I can add on this, so specifically on the capacity building actions, this is something that comes out all the time, right? That jurisdictions see capacity building program as key, and they are definitely key for any climate action plan. So, however, they cannot be quantified in terms of emission reductions, but those are what Tom just called enabling conditions or implementation mechanisms. So you basically can incorporate any capacity building program actions with others measures that are quantifiable so that they get to be part of the actually implementation of those and not left behind, because you will need to implement a bunch of these actions. To implement a bunch of these actions, you will need to build local capacities that goes from internal capacity within the governments, but also technical capacities, right? Operators and so on. So you can incorporate those within your priority actions and the comprehensive plan. I would say definitely for the PCAP, look at those key sectors, key emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, tackle those, and any actions that can give you some immediate and quantifiable reductions, and that also kind of ready for implementation. Because, unfortunately, you need to move to the next grant application pretty soon and have those kind of ready to go.
Great, thank you.
Great. I'll go ahead and move on to the next question from Aaron Young. And I'm not sure which government Aaron is from, but the question is, do any of the regional climate action plans that you have worked on have an example of identifying and implementing policy at a regional scale when there is a little to no structure for regional policy?
Yeah, I would go to the Southern California Association of Governments, and it was one of the four designated regional authorities in California that were required under state legislation to submit carbon reduction plans that were compliant with state goals that were translated down to regional level. And I think I put a snap of that process up, and we've got part of that report on our website. But this was a process that was done by all of those different regional authorities in California that they went through specifically for that process. As they did that, functionally what they did is they went through the process of mapping out the implementation authorities and matching levels of government within their region that would be required to enable the region to meet its goals. And in some cases, that was not at a regional level. It was at the local level, cities, townships, et cetera. In other cases, it was at a broader level where the region had authorities for that. And then in some cases, it was at the state level where the region was specifying the exact kind of support it would need from the state to be able to implement its portion of the regional goal. So they did a combination of these things.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from any of the participants before we wrap things up? Go ahead, Glade.
Yeah, this is Glade Sowards from the Utah Division of Air Quality. And Tom, we worked with you to develop our, it was a 2005 inventory in or around 2006. We didn't end up working with CCS on our actual climate plan that came after that, but it was we did model a lot of what we did on your work and analysis and kind of framework. So this is good to kind of be reacquainted with. And I'm kind of thinking of that inventory process as being a kind of a key first step. And what I've noticed just over my years with climate action planning is that GHG inventories are quite different than criteria pollutant inventories that some of us air agencies are familiar with. And to hit the ground running, obviously we can start with what EPA has, but we think there are probably some gaps there especially for a Western state like Utah that has some oil and gas methane emissions that may not be accurately or fully captured by EPA's approach. I'm wondering if you have any insight you could share on kind of striking that balance between, this kind of immediate need to have an inventory for policy work and stakeholder engagement, but also, ideally we would have a better inventory to work with. Is there some kind of a guidance you can give us on that?
Well, the first thing I could do would be to point you to the EPA guidance on this. They have both a template, but then EPA has broader guidance on its greenhouse gas inventories. And I think it has now developed or is developing guidance on projections as well. So, I think that's the first place I'd go, is to see what EPA is saying in terms of what it would like you all to do. But at the same time, I think you're absolutely right. That's really a minimum level or a base level. And you can understand why it's structured that way, because there's so many unique conditions within states. And that's this process I call augmentation, which is identifying areas that may not be included or adequately covered, and including those because they're out, or the methodology for including them to be able to put in place a methodology that does a better job of capturing local conditions. So the classic case, I think before we did your inventory, we were working in the state of New Mexico, and the greenhouse gas inventory system at the time didn't cover the oil and gas sector. So a really big part of what we ended up talking with everybody about was putting in place baselines and best practices for oil and gas. And that's been 20 or so years ago. But that's because there was just a complete gap there. And that gap has since been filled. I don't know whether it's been totally filled, but it still requires a heck of a lot of customization, because within states, how you handle oil and gas just has way, way more local complications. So that would really be an example of how you do it. I guess the other area to call out is forestry. One of the things that we saw repetitively was similar issues in forestry, where the forest systems and forest practices had so much variation. The systems were very different, not just in the West, but there's the Intermountain West and there's the coastal West, and things were very, very different from one to the next. So you really needed to put in place something that was much more tailor-made to deal with that issue.
Okay, thank you.
All righty, if there are no further questions.
Jillian, may I just ask, I think we may have Michael Dexter from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network with us. And if Michael is with us, and Michael, if you would like to add anything to the conversation here, we'd welcome it, because we know you've also been working with a number of localities on this issue.
Thanks, Tom. I will just point to what I put in the chat. We do have an updated list of how those states that have refused to participate, how that money will be reallocated, and the eligible MSAs as a result. We do see now on the national list, we are up to 72, Columbia, South Carolina, and there's still the opportunity that should any of the higher up MSAs decline to participate, that number could grow even higher. But happy to answer any question. Michael Dexter from Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. Thanks again.
Michael, one thing I'm curious in your conversations, if it's come up, has been the interplay between the SMSAs, the big metro areas, and then states and localities, because I know that's a bit of an open box everybody's sorting through.
Absolutely. So I will say with the MSAs that we are aware of there to be a single lead entity decided at this point, one of which in the Southeast has already put in their notice of intent to participate. That's the Atlanta Regional Commission. We do anticipate that there to be more of those sort of regional entities taking a lead, whether that be a council of governments, a metropolitan planning organization, or a regional planning council. For many of those that are looking statewide or looking across the nation, there are many interests in having a regional entity that has experience working across multiple jurisdictions to really take the lead there. One of the areas that we do highlight the benefit for MSAs to participate is that it does allow for them to help identify some of those priority climate action opportunities, whether that be on the greenhouse gas reduction side or the enhancing carbon sink side. So while we do see several of the states in the Southeast and nationally that are participating, there's also the opportunity that having that more localized experience and input could help identify some of those priority actions that are more representative of those communities, which might not also be reflected on a state level plan.
Excellent. Jillian, I know also, I think we have Heather Navarro of the Midwest Climate Collaborative with us. And if Heather is still with us, she's been working with a very large group of local institutions in the Midwest. And I'm wondering, Heather, from your perspective, if there's any other key issues here that you think are of importance to the localities and then their ability to work with states in your region.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. We're really just trying to take stock of, who is interested in applying and figuring out sort of collaborative opportunities we can offer, given that a lot of these folks are operating from a place of limited capacity and are asking the same questions. So we, and actually I can put some details in the chat. Tomorrow, we're just hosting an informal conversation with anybody in the Midwest. We've been focused more on the MSAs, but if there are folks in state government who are looking for collaborators, we'll be talking tomorrow. One, just for folks to share what they're doing, what resources they're finding that are helpful. And then if there is a way that the Midwest Climate Collaborative can serve in that role as a convener, for folks, either in an official capacity as a grant partner, or maybe it's just bringing folks together to share best practices and identify collaborative opportunities on a more local level. So this has been really helpful. Grateful that this information's out there, and I'll put my email in the chat if anybody wants to reach out. Thank you.
Heather, do I recall, is it 12 or 16 states that your collaborative operates in?
It's 12 states, and it's the Census Bureau's designation of the Midwest. So the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and then east to Ohio and everything in between and up. And
tribes included?
Tribes are included right now. So we're a year old, our collaborative is. And so right now we include local governments, institutions of higher ed, nonprofits, and industry and business. And definitely open to, and folks do not need to be a member of the collaborative to join this conversation, these conversations that we're having.
To your knowledge, are all 12 of the states that you operate in going to be applying for the pollution reduction grant?
As of yesterday, when I looked at the EPA's form, there were 2. I believe it. Shoot, I don't know if I have it in front of me. I thought it was North Dakota. It's one of the Dakotas. Might be South Dakota actually. And maybe somebody else can help me out. Shoot, I just looked at it yesterday. I don't have it up in front of me, but there were. Oh, is it Iowa? Okay. Yeah, and I know the Iowa Environmental Council is pretty active in that state. So, but yeah, 10 of the 12 did submit the NOIP.
And are the MSAs part of your group, and are you involved in any conversations with them?
So we're talking to folks. So, Aaron Young and Anna Cott, who are on this call, are with the COG in the St. Louis area. Also been talking with the folks in Kansas City, with Mark, the Mid-America Regional Council. The Madison Area Regional Planning Commission is one of our members. So yes, reaching out to those folks and making more connections on this call today, actually. And yeah, we are housed, I'll just let folks know too, we are housed at Washington University. So that, we can play that role in terms of as an academic partner, but also we are really kind of a convener across sectors with a focus on those 12 states. And yeah, like I said, I'll put some details in the chat. So for anybody who wants to join a conversation, we're doing one tomorrow, and then we've got another one scheduled in early May after the April deadline.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
And do we still have Leah from Hawaii?
Yes, I'm here.
Leah, did we miss anything, or is there anything that you can add here or invite us to follow up on?
I think you folks did an amazing job. I've been lucky enough to have your folks' support on putting this together, the application together, the work plan. The only thing I would add to this is, really take advantage of the fact that this funding can be used to better coordinate and plan to how to access funding. I know it's a requirement of the EPAs, but if you look at it from the flip side of the state, I know we've all been grappling with accessing or how to access all of the federal opportunities that are out there. And because you can hire personnel, you can just hire somebody to look at this for you and help to coordinate within the state and counties. So it really is that ability to build capacity that we've always wanted to do. So yeah, it's just a really great opportunity to take that step as well.
Leah, thank you for the call out that I think has come up in virtually every conversation at the state and local level, and particularly with localities, but I'd say even with big MSAs, has been the capacity issue, the need to put in place more help, inside help and outside help in order to do this. And so the application, the $3 million funding, as you say, certainly does provide eligibility for capacity expansion in order to implement these grants, and that's a really critical thing for everybody to be aware of. It's our expectation that the follow-up competitive grants for the $4.6 billion implementation funds also are going to support capacity and enabling environment activities, and it really the ability to move forward with direct investment activities is contingent on the expansion of capacity. So these are directly linked. So our advice is don't be shy. If you have a capacity need, don't be shy about saying it.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you everyone for joining us
Juliana,
today.
sorry if I interrupt you. We have a question from
Please do.
Aaron Young. Maybe I think it's the last one. Just want to make sure we address that as well. It's about if it's a reasonable expectation to complete these plans with this budget timeline. I mean, I can take it, give you an answer. I think it is. I mean, I think all states can do it, but you definitely need to plan well around that. I think the key is really have a good work plan, put a good work plan together, and as Tom was saying, build in your budget additional capacity that you will need internally and externally to move forward quickly. Don't forget the work you have already done. So build off of that, enhance that work, and don't start from the beginning. But I think really the key is planning. If you plan well, both the stakeholder engagement and the actual plan development in terms of policy, in terms of analysis, you can do it.
If you need help with the choreography of that, just let us know.
Definitely. Because yeah, it can get pretty messy when you have a lot of actors, players at the same time around the tables. So you need to have your technical groups, making some technical decision, but you need to also and higher level a group that, can help move things forward, and you don't go back anytime, and start all over again.
Fantastic. If there are no further questions, Tom, are there any other slides besides? Thank you to everyone. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the Under2 Coalition is available to kind of connect and have more opportunities like this, as well as the Midwest Climate Collaborative and the other organizations that spoke today. We're more than happy to work with all of these various governments. And so my email's in the chat, and I shared Center for Climate Strategies website in the chat as well. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. I will follow up with both slides and a YouTube link with this video. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.